Yo guys, what's going on? My name is HackingIsFreedom and Happy New Year! I hope everyone had an amazing holiday. Welcome to the 26th episode of What Was Cut, a series where we take a look at what exactly was cut from our favorite games. Today we're going to be talking about Pac-Man World 2. This was one of my all-time favorite platformer games growing up. I sat in front of my grandmother's 30-inch tube TV and played this for a good 2 hours every day before I went to school. It was crazy. She actually got me all 3 Pac-Man World games, so thanks to her, I've 100%ed them all. Anywho, let's eat some ghosts and figure out what was cut. Okay, we're going to start with the unused textures, as that's kind of the main thing that's been left over in this game. First up, we have an early version of the tokens you collect in various levels. It originally featured Pac-Man with his iconic thumbs-up pose, but in the final game, they basically reused the texture from the first Pac-Man World game. I personally like this older version a lot better. These 3 icons are from a much earlier point in development, and they were originally used as menu icons. This first one is labeled as Arcade, and we can assume this was most likely a placeholder to access the arcade. The icon in the middle is labeled as Mountain, and this was 100% used for the Ice River Run level. And the final one is labeled as Mountain 2, and it just seems to be an earlier version of the previous icon, just with some errors. This texture can be found in the level data of Ghost Bayou, and I believe it's an early texture of Pac-Man's water reflection texture. These 2 icons are identical in appearance, however, they are labeled differently. This first one is labeled as Options, which we can assume was going to be used as an icon to access the Options menu, and the second one is just labeled as Pac-Man, which I can only assume was an early placeholder for when the 3D Pac-Man walks from level to level while in the level selection menu screen. These 3 small icons are of Pukas, and sadly, it's completely unknown as to where they were supposed to be used. They're located in a folder labeled Puka within the Objects folder in the game's files. So, perhaps they were supposed to be used as background elements? I'm not really sure though. In earlier builds, instead of using text, it seems like the developers wanted to use textures of the actual buttons you would need to press, as there's leftover start buttons for the Xbox, GameCube, and the PlayStation. There's also leftover button textures from the PC version, as well as some random blank ones. Strangely, these button textures seem to be a unique version to the PC port of the game. They're much different than the ones used on the PS2, and even if you use a PlayStation controller on the PC version, the game still won't display these buttons. These 2 textures are early reflection textures. This first one is from a really early stage of development, and this second one is what was supposed to be used in the final game, but I guess the developers just forgot. Because in the final game, the golden fruits strangely use Pac-Man's steel ball reflection texture, which obviously in turn makes the fruits look kinda bronze. This leaf texture is strangely only found on the GameCube version, and it's actually present in the data for every single level. This may be from another scrap mechanic where you could hide in leaf piles, or this may just be a cut environmental effect. I'm not entirely sure. Next, we have 3 strange-looking arrow textures. This first one is labeled as Test Pat 1, short for Test Pattern 1, and I believe this is just a simple temp texture, judging by the name. This one is labeled as Test Numb Lava, and I'm assuming this was a temp texture used to display which way the lava was supposed to be flowing. And the final one is labeled as D Arrow 1, short for Directional Arrow 1, and I'm assuming this was an early temp texture for the directional bounce pads. Speaking of bounce pads, this texture here is a super simple and super early version of the normal bounce pads. These 3 textures were all used in the level Ice River Run as simple placeholders. This texture is a bit of a mystery, as I don't really know what the purpose of it was. It's labeled as Black Ant Refle 1, which obviously indicates it was used as some sort of reflection texture, although it doesn't really look like one. This may have something to do with the also cut anteater enemy, but that's just my guess. A bell was supposed to appear in chests like other collectible fruits, but for some reason it was scrapped. There's actually still code for this bell being spawned in the Volcanic Panic level in the PS2 version, but it's just disabled. So I'm guessing the decision to cut this was pretty late in development. There's also 2 other early fruit textures located in the same folder as the bell. The melon was a bit more brownish in the earlier stages, and this peach is oddly labeled as Apple 2. Also, for some reason, the melon's texture is misspelled in both the early and final versions. Among those early fruit textures is another strange one, this empty cup. Since it's found with the other fruit and bell objects, I'm guessing this was also supposed to appear in chests, but the true purpose of it is unknown. This, I believe, is a very early version of the title screen, as it has a drawing of the same dock that's featured in the final game, and it's also found in a folder labeled as Menu Stuff. It also shows a much earlier version of the game's logo. And speaking of the game's logo, there's actually another early version left in the game's files, although it looks pretty similar to the final games, just with some minor changes. This goo texture was supposed to be seen when defeating a Pachycite, beetle, or a spider enemy. This actually would have been a cool little detail. I wonder why they felt the need to cut this. These enemies here use a slightly bigger goo texture, and to me, it's always been kind of strange that they do produce goo. Like, why would they cut the goo effect from the only enemies that are actually bugs? This texture can be found in the data for the Treewood Forest level, and judging by the text and the color, I'm assuming this was used as a placeholder for the rock structure near the end of the level. It could have also been for the end of Canyon Chaos as well. In this footage, you can see an earlier version of the grass texture. However, I believe this may be the grass texture for the cut frog pond level, because to me, the texture just looks like it belongs in a swampy pond type of area, you know? And we're going to end off with a pretty interesting one. This texture of his signature belongs to Chris DiMartini, and he was an artist that worked on Pac-Man World 2. I don't think this texture can be seen anywhere in-game, but it is located in the data of a few different levels. Onto the cut and changes to the various levels. Bedewing Woods is up first, as it has the most changes. I actually used to call this place Bedewing Woods as a kid. Anyway, it seems the developers made the first area much easier in the first revision of the game. Like at the very beginning, they added a huge safety net under the platform so their player wouldn't die. They removed 2 directional bounce pads, which in turn made this area much more simplified, and halfway through the first tree climb, the developers added a checkpoint. Once at the top, you originally had to rev roll across to the Galaxian tree and traverse down the other side. But in the first revision, they added a directional bounce pad that basically takes you to the next checkpoint. You would have needed to take this path, which would have led you to these 3 bounce pads that take you to the next checkpoint. You can still see these bounce pads in the final game, but they're no longer accessible from this part of the tree. The pack dots in the crate were moved to these spots in the first revision, after they scrapped the earlier pathway. So really nothing was lost from these changes. This is an earlier version of the map concept art shown in the in-game museum, and really, it just shows that the entire 5th world was a late development choice. I guess the devs thought the game was too short, so they added the Scuba Duba, Shark Attack, Yellow Pack Marine, and Whale on a sub-levels. Finally, we're going to talk about an actual fully cut area called Frog Pond. These are the only 2 images that show us a glimpse into this cut level, and they were actually supposed to be shown in the in-game museum as well. I believe Frog Pond is where Pac-Dot Pond is now, due to the similar name and art style. The only other remnants of this level are these 2 icons. The first one is from a much earlier point in development and it's simply named FR Pond 1, and the other is literally named Frog Pond, so we can assume this would have been the final version of the level icon. Next, I just quickly want to talk about some of the cool, yet very broken debug features. If you press L3 and up on the D-pad, you'll open a sound test menu, and surprisingly, everything here works. You can test every single sound in the game on command here. It gets a bit hard to read sometimes, and sometimes certain sounds won't stop playing. Next, if you press L3 and R1, you'll open up a lighting editor, and you may think this is the global lighting. Nope, it just seems to change the character lighting, as you can just barely see under Pac-Man. No text renders on screen when using this menu either, so that's good. There's also a fog editor that pretty much functions just like the lighting editor. If you press L3 and down on the D-pad, once again, no text renders on screen, and it only seems to change the fog or at least the light setting while in an interior. I tried changing the values while outside, and I couldn't see anything changing. Next, we have a pretty useless function, but I guess it helped the developers. If you press L3 and left on the D-pad, you'll activate an option called Camera Display, and that's all it does, nothing else here changes. If you press L3 and right on the D-pad, you'll activate the music test. Sadly, this doesn't work either. It displays the sounds like I'm selecting something, but nothing actually happens. Lastly, we have 2 versions of the level selection menu. This first one is from a super early point in development, as most of the levels still display in progress on them. However, for some reason, the build date displays March 1st, 2002, which is actually 5 days after the game released, so I'm not entirely sure what build date the game is reading. Sadly, nothing here works, and every option leads to a crash. The second one is much newer, and it displays the same build date, so that must be the actual internal build date of the game. Kinda weird. Everything here works except for the menu labeled as test stuff. Everything in there leads to a crash, but at least we can see some names of the developers that worked on the game. As we come to the end of the video, it's time for the oddities I found throughout the game. There's some interesting radar textures left over in the level data of Yellow Pack Marine. It seems like the C-bomb shooting minigame originally had a small radar on screen, with a small icon of you as the submarine, and this sound would play each time a bomb was detected. In a beta build, specifically in the level Yellow Pack Marine, Pac-Man originally had a piece of dialogue that was removed in the final version. This is probably why we see the camera pan the Pac-Man in the final game's cutscene. Almost all of the dialogue here was changed up from the beta as well. Speaking of Pac-Man having dialogue, he was also supposed to have these 2 sayings after defeating 2 different bosses. This first one was going to be displayed after the interaction with Pinky in the level Pinky's Revenge, and the second one was supposed to be displayed after Clyde's introduction in the level Clyde in the Caldera. There's a strange object that can still be modded back into the game, just without its textures, and it seems to be some sort of rope bridge that breaks as you cross it. It's unknown as to where this was actually supposed to be used, but the placement here is just to showcase it. On the title screen, just off camera to the right, is a random fishing rod and a stool. There must have been plans for Pac-Man to sit on the dock with the stool and fish. Or there may have been plans for one of the background characters to use it. I don't think these objects are used at any point in the main menu, although please correct me if I'm wrong. There's also some unused code left over for a language setting. If you re-enable this setting, it takes over the brightness option menu, and the only other language you can change it to is Japanese. I'm not sure if they wanted to have this setting properly included in the game, or if it's just a remnant from an earlier point in development. This is a pretty cool one. In a beta build, you can find a completely cut enemy that I believe was replaced by this beetle because they're roughly the same size. I honestly prefer the gator enemy, but oh well. Finally, we're going to end off with a completely unused punching mechanic that would basically stun bigger enemies and knock out smaller enemies. It's a little broken with the hit detection, but it does work. This may have been cut in favor of the backflip kick, or possibly because Pac-Man throwing his dukes around just didn't seem right. And that's all I have for Pac-Man World 2. A big thanks to Legatus Cubing for suggesting this one, and a big thanks to Crazy Otto for his findings as well. A lot of Pac-Man World documentation is extremely out of date, so hopefully the new information and findings get some documentation soon. I feel like it's been a while since I did a fan suggestion, so why not start off the new year with one of my favorite childhood games and a fan suggestion all in one. Anywho, if you have a suggestion for the next What Was Cut episode, please feel free to comment down below. With that being said, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.